Good morning again, everybody. Thank you for your patience as we get started this morning. For those of you who are online, we are really grateful that you've stayed to join us. Welcome to all of our panelists, and I want to say special welcome to Justice Feldman, who is our panel organizer for us, part of our racial justice team with Dave and Joe, who have been helping lead us through these conversations. For those of you who are online, when we get to the question and answer portion, unfortunately, they won't be able to hear you, but they will be able to see your chat, and I will help facilitate that. So if you do have questions at the end, type them in the chat, and we'll help get that conversation facilitated for you. So for those who are here in the room and those who are online, would you please give a warm round of applause and welcome to all of our panelists to Justice, and thank them for being here with us this morning.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this wonderful conversation that we're about to have around diversity and inclusion in the criminal justice space. Today, you'll be able to hear from professionals, attorneys, law enforcement officers, organizers that will speak to some of the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts within their arena. I will be asking a set of pointed questions to panelists, and they will have the opportunity to choose which question they would like to answer. So with that being said, big round of applause for our panelists for their time this morning. I really appreciate it. And we will dive right in. The first question is, what is your definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And how do you apply diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy within the space that you work in? Yes.
Well, first, I've had my booster shot and everything, so I like to make sure that everyone can actually hear me. First off, thanks for having me here, Justin. You reached out to me, and these are the platforms in which I try to be available for, because it is important. My name is Trey Hearn-Pollard. I am the founder and CEO of We Push for Peace, and we do a lot of work in the inner city, primarily in the North Minneapolis corridor. Diversity and inclusion, obviously a very sensitive subject for most people. And it's simply because people, the space that's created for them oftentimes doesn't allow them to maybe ask some of those heartfelt questions, or they don't feel comfortable having that discussion. One of the things I've done is, first off, I've built my organization on those very morals and values and those principles. So when individuals are in my space, they know that they can have that conversation with me. So I think it starts with the leader of that entity, whereas they create that space, and so therefore that conversation can actually be had. So that's how I've done it within my organization. Not to mention, it's very, very important, especially when you have conversations with younger individuals from all diverse backgrounds, et cetera. Again, creating that space, a level of comfort that those young men and women can actually ask those questions that they wouldn't normally be able to have or ask in other areas or other platforms that might have been created for them.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you for that reply, because I do agree 100% that I believe part of the reason why we find ourselves experiencing so much divisiveness and division is because we don't talk about it. We avoid the uncomfortable conversation, and it's going to be very challenging for me to come together to address the issues of any form of division, whether it be racism, sexism, or any of those, if we don't talk about it first. It doesn't end there, but it has to start with a conversation so we can gain understanding. And Justice, thank you for the question. I think it's an important question, and it may sound very elementary to ask how we define it, but if we don't establish a baseline of the definitions of what we're talking about, then it's going to be very hard for us to be moving in the same direction. So by definition, whenever I share with audiences, I help them understand that although diversity, equity, and inclusion are linked and should be linked, they are still very distinct, and it's important that we understand how they should coexist in the, I would say, consequences that come when we treat them independent of each other. So diversity, by definition, if you were to look it up, it's the state of being different. That's the definition of diversity, the state of being different. And what's interesting about that definition is it's a state of being. Diversity on its own does not do anything. We can look around this room and see tremendous amounts of diversity right now, but if we don't do something, if we don't take some form of action, we cannot benefit from the gift, and it truly is a gift, the gift of diversity that is available to us. Now, equity by definition is fair and impartial treatment, but a more layman's terms on defining equity as how people often confuse it with equality. Where equality is treating everyone the same, equity is meeting people where they are, giving them what they need to succeed, because we may not all need the exact same thing to achieve success, just based on where we are on our journey and how we started. And so equity to me is ensuring people have what they need to exceed and a willingness to meet them where they are. And then inclusion, by definition, is the act of making people feel a sense of belonging. And so the operative words there are how our actions make people feel. And therein lies the connection. So we can have all the diversity in the world, but if we're not taking some sort of action to make others feel a sense of belonging, we're not going to achieve that sense of inclusion that we seek.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Craig Kryling. I'm one of the captains with the Hopkins Police Department. And on behalf of the City of Hopkins and the Hopkins Police Department, thank you to Shepherd of the Hills, Pastor Scott, the rest of the panelists here this morning, Justice, for hosting this event. And I'd like just to build off of what True said there. And for the police department, as we bring forth equity and inclusion into our daily work, a lot of what that means for us is just being humble and reaching out to our community and being there, listening to them, going to community events such as this, going to apartments and neighborhood gatherings, and not only being present, but hosting a conversation and understanding what our community needs from us so that we can be those true actors on what that means, what they need, what do they need from us, and how can we be good stewards to our community.
Thank you. We'll jump right into the second question. What are some measurable goals around diversity and inclusion that your organization measures from a data and analytics standpoint?
I can talk about some of the work that we do. I know that I am listed as the CEO of True Access, which is a bridge building organization that helps bridge gaps across differences. And so I founded that back in 2012. But I also have the privilege of serving as the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for the Minnesota Timberwolves and Lynx. And so in that regard, I think areas where I'm not going to say it's easy to do, but it's easy to measure are workforce diversity, fan base diversity, supplier diversity. That's quantitative, just kind of looking at the percentages, looking at the numbers. Are we increasing our diversity? Do we have equity across race, age, gender, sexual orientation, religion, all forms of diversity? Do we have equity from a number standpoint, from a percentages standpoint? And so, but if we go back to understanding the definition of inclusion, that's one piece of it. But measuring how people feel, whether or not they have a sense of belonging, a sense of value, a sense of comfort, a sense of familiarity. And so that's going to require us to do a lot of the things that the captain just talked about, just taking the time to actually engage with people and having dialogue and conversation so that we can understand if they feel as though they are existing in an environment that fosters equity and inclusion. And that just requires taking the time to engage with people and conduct some more qualitative exploratories.
Thank you.
My name is Hal Wen, and I'm the division director of the Ramsey County Attorney's Office. So what that really means is that I'm in charge of our adult trial prosecutors. There's about 37 of them. I've been a prosecutor for about 12 years, and prior to being a prosecutor, I was a correctional officer for 3 and a police officer for another 3 years. So, you know, in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, you know, what does that mean? I think it's just such a complicated question, but it deserves to be asked. And for me, it's more than just you know, okay. I think the standard traditional prosecution thing was person commits a crime, law enforcement gets involved, law enforcement arrests person, then there's a file, then there's a police report, then there's a prosecutor, then if they don't take the offer, the deal, the plea bargain, whatever, then we add charges, we up charges, then we convict them with the jury, then we send them to prison. That's the traditional sort of assembly line view of the criminal justice system. And frankly, that is a system that is still in place today and has been in place for a very long time. It's working as it's been designed to do. But when we talk about diversity for the sake of diversity, if you don't do anything with it, I totally agree with you. What is it? It's nothing. So how do we meet people where they are? That's the equity part, right? Well, are people committing crimes just because what? They're bad, they're criminals, are people of, you know, if you look at the statistics, it's like, you know, are people of color just committing crimes because people of color are more predispositioned to commit crimes? I think if the answer is yes in your mind correctly, we have to stop there right away, because that answer is no. There are many other factors, right, that come into play when one commits a crime. And it kind of depends on what crime as well. So the traditional thing about prosecution is that we're not just thinking about, you know, let's put people in prison, let's incarcerate people. One of the tenets of prosecution really is ministers of justice. And that's a special particularized thing for prosecutors, unlike any other attorney. We are also ministers of justice because the power of the state is vast. It is strong, and frankly, it can be debilitating if we use it in a wrong way. For example, if someone commits a second-degree assault and they don't take a deal, and if the facts are whatever they are that are sufficient for probable cause, I could add an attempted murder. When we think of the second-degree assault penalty, it's here. If we think of attempted murder, it jumps to here. And then if that person has prior felony points for, let's just say, maybe financial transaction card fraud, or they wrote a bad check before and whatever, they aggregate it, it becomes a felony. Now all of a sudden you have someone who has just committed a non-violent property crime that was financial transaction card fraud. They might have committed an additional crime now years later for second-degree assault. And if they don't take my plea offer or my deal, and if I'm a person who's a prosecutor who doesn't look at the person as a person rather than as a defendant, and I want to just hammer them, and I just want to add the charges and stack, I could send them away for a very, very long time. But what is the ends of that? And who is that person? And do they go every Thursday or Tuesday to their mom's house and brings the medication to them? Do they, go and shovel the sidewalk to help their neighbors? Do they, they might do this thing and this thing, but there's a lot of other good things that they do. And so when I take that person away from society, what am I doing to that person, to their network, to their family, right? And victims have absolutely a place in this paradigm that I'm talking about. But statistics have shown, and actually a lot of surveys have shown, that victims don't really feel just better when someone goes to prison. It almost means kind of nothing. They feel better when we engage with them and we find out what they want. And usually what they want to know, and frankly, I've done murder cases, I've done assault cases, I've done rape cases, really bad cases, and most of the time victims just want to know, why did it happen to me? Why did it happen to me? Are you coming back to do this to me again? Is this something really personal? And frankly, most of the time it's not. So when we talk about the criminal justice system, when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and we talk about some of these statistics, if we look at the statistics, they've been built for years and years and years, and I think we have to ask ourselves why we capture those statistics. And there are other statistics that I think that we need to think about. How come the criminal justice system touches people of color more than it touches, white populations? And how come when it touches those communities of color, that those communities of color end up in prison in a much more disproportionate manner than our white counterparts? And just asking the question doesn't mean that one should feel uncomfortable or bad or responsible if you're a person who's white. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that it is important to ask those questions. And Justice opened up this panel with saying that we're going to ask some pointed questions. And I think that if we just stand in diversity without asking some really hard questions, without saying some truths about our system, then we don't change. And so if we don't do anything with that diversity, with that, then we won't transform. So that's kind of my precursor to some of the conversations that I hope that we will have today.
Thank you for that. And then Jazz, I see the panelists here. If you want to come up, we'll dive right into the third question. How are some community members and citizens that you're impacting within the space of diversity and inclusion feeling about your efforts? What are some of the feedback you're getting from community members around some of the community engagement and diversity and inclusion initiatives that you're focused on?
Well, I think that a vast majority of those spaces that we're talking about is pertaining to exactly where your work is being noticed. And when I say that is for the organization, we, unfortunately have been targeting some of the hot areas in the Twin Cities, where we partner with, say, Mr. Hodges, or Chief Arredondo, or Sheriff Hutchison, and things to that magnitude. And so within my organization, due to partnerships, I've been able to hire over 230 individuals within the last 6 months by itself, right? And when I say that is from a perspective of oftentimes when these young men and women come home from prison or they're going through court or something, things to those magnitudes, you have a lot of organizations that state like, yeah, we can give them a second chance. But the reality of it is it's not actually a second chance because you're not willing to hire them. And even if you are willing to hire them, you're not giving them livable, sustainable wages. In turn, they're gonna go back to what they know how to do, right? So that's how we've been extremely impactful within the organization across the Twin Cities area. And again, having these experiences from a lived, right, is to say, I can't speak to anybody else, but how can an individual speak to a young man that might have been in prison or might be going through court or what have you, and give him some sound advice? Right? That's like almost impossible, and that's a lot of what's happening, right? I'm not going to give you that sound advice. I'm going to first of all give you some accountability, right? Look in the mirror, because where you are is because of what you did. Once we get to that point, now we can move forward, and that has been a challenge for myself within the organization. But then when you add a program doing part to like partnerships with Mr. Hodges and the Department of Public Safety, amongst other government agencies, you put things in place that is needed in the community or from the community. Primarily, like, how can I create something that is livable and sustainable for this young man versus me just telling him I want to do that, right? So we started a commercial driver's license program, and to date, we've had 30 individuals that come through that program, 30 individuals now that's working, that's now that now has that livable, sustainable job, that's now not standing at that corner on at the gas station, and like we have that now, right? So again, impactful. While we don't do this work to get a pat on the back, we had been noticed by the city of Minneapolis, and Chief Arredondo awarded We Push for Peace an award, which was, I really didn't understand what it was for, but I appreciated it, right? Because again, I don't do this for awards, right? And we did the same for Juneteenth Community Award, which not only the organization, but Mr. Hodges received as well. So, I often say that your action has to reciprocate anything that comes out of your mouth. And if you do that, then it's going to be noticed. So that's how we've been able to impact the individuals that we come in contact with on a day-to-day basis in the area in which we're serving.
Thank you.
On one point with regard to the stats, right? Like, how do we keep stats? And I think that the conversation in our country, or maybe, as they say, all politics is local. I think the really important thing that we should not forget is our law enforcement partners. I mean, they are our front lines. They are the ones, and like I said, I was a police officer, albeit for just a few years, correctional officer for 3. I still remember the anxiety of walking up to a squad car and touching the back of the trunk to see if that thing is actually latched. And then, kind of moving to the side and looking inside and getting past the B pillar and all of those things. Our law enforcement partners do a tremendous job. And they do that job day in and they do that job day out. And oftentimes it is an isolating job. And so when they bring us a file, when they bring us a charge, when they have done the investigation, I think we absolutely owe it, I think, as prosecutors, to have a clear communication with our law enforcement partners and say, hey, what do you think about this file? What do you think about this individual? What do you think should happen, right? Because they've done the legwork. And frankly, then we can have open dialogues with law enforcement and say, well, what do you think about this? Or I'm thinking about this, or maybe this person needs that. Most often, I believe law enforcement just wants the thing to stop, meaning the bad act or the call to the same place over and over again. And if we can figure out a way to do that, then I think all parties, frankly, are happy. If we can do that without, frankly, sending someone to prison, that's even better. Because the truth of the matter is, 96% of the people we incarcerate and send to prison, they come back into society within 3 to 5 years. That's it. In the state of Minnesota, our largest crime that we have is first-degree murder, which can only be done through an impaneled grand jury. And that's life imprisonment for only some very rare circumstances. But the vast majority of everything else, people are coming back. And when people are coming back, they're not just other people. They're your friends, they're your neighbors, they're your loved ones. They're the people that you will run into at the grocery store. And so let's figure out how to give them those tools. Let's figure out how to make sure that we just don't do it again. And so if we forget our law enforcement partners, I think it's a huge mistake. And also, it doesn't help anything, because here's what's going to happen, and it's happened to me. I'll be sitting at the muster table, and I'll look through the sheets, and I'll say, why did they dismiss this file? I did good work on that. There's nothing wrong with this case. And then I'm mad for another hour or two, and then I send the county attorney or the prosecutor an email, and then I got to wait another day to kind of figure out what happened. And then like a week goes by, and I've had 17 other calls that I'm worried about and trying to get my police reports done. I think it is incumbent upon maybe the law enforcement officer and the prosecutor, we kind of have just each other's cell phone numbers. We can kind of just talk. Anytime I get into a room with any captains or chiefs or even a road police officer, I'm like, here's my cell phone number. I've had it since 11th grade. That's a good thing and a bad thing, but just call me. Because oftentimes I think officers just need to do that. And it can be at 9 o'clock at night because most people work night shifts. So the communication of equity and justice and keeping stats, it's really important, but I think the relationships within the criminal justice system of the practitioners, that's even more important, because I cannot talk to officer so-and-so and say, this is the right thing to do for this person, if that officer and I do not have a relationship. It's just gonna die right there. And then I'm gonna do what I'm gonna do, which is do whatever I want to do with the file because I have the authority to do that. And then this officer is gonna be mad because they're gonna say, why did you do that? And we don't talk. We've gotta talk.
Yeah, I'd just like to add onto that and back to when we talk about metrics, when we talk about statistics, from a local law enforcement level, what that means to us is who's still coming to see us when we go out for a community event, when we host a coffee event, or we're going out to do a community academy. Are people showing up? And even further back, when we talk about that prosecution side of it and the communication, is local law enforcement, we aren't the police. We are the community. We're the city's police department, and we need to hear those voices. We're there. We're working with the community prior to anybody making a bad choice. And that's one thing. I have a personal philosophy. Thankfully, there are not very many bad people in the world. There are a tremendous amount of good people that sometimes just make bad decisions. And we've all done things where we've made bad decisions in life. Unfortunately, some of those bad decisions have dire consequences, and not just dire consequences for the here and the moment, but ones that chase us for the rest of our lives. And that's what we need to recognize, is we have members of our community that are here and now, and they may make a bad decision. And thankfully, they're going to come back to our community someday. And how can we best set up an environment where people feel welcome, where people can prosper, where people can have future job opportunities at that livable wage, not just a livable wage, but one that they can prosper on themselves, go on, and that they can do further good and overcome any bad decisions they may have had. And so we look at that statistic, that metric of how are we doing. Is our community still engaging us? Are they still asking questions of us? Are they still seeking change? And we as law enforcement, whether that's me at local law enforcement level, whether that's the assistant commissioner at the state level, how can we improve? How can we keep looking at ourselves so that we can keep having people come back? And those questions are, how are people feeling about us? Thankfully, I can say in this local community out here, and I'll speak for the city of Edina where we are today as well, but people are still engaging us. People are still coming to us, and I think that's a positive thing. So I'm intrigued by the commercial driver's license program. I think that's an outstanding way to build upon the talents that people have and giving people an opportunity. And I agree on the communication side. And that's a problem that I think we all recognize, whether we're talking about criminal justice, we're talking about the community. The biggest thing is when we come together and we have conversations, when we have the communication about things, that's when we really learn what's going on. We can each have our own thoughts. We can each live in our silos, and we can each have our own opinions on things, but we need to reach out to others. We need to find out what's going on. So thank you for bringing up that point. Thank you for that support. I agree. I've had my cell phone for a long time, and sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes that's a bad thing. But again, just to reiterate that, it is all about the communication and coming together and having these conversations.
Thank you, Captain.
Good morning, everyone. I've been quiet up until now, just really enjoying listening to the fellow panelists, but my name is Anna Hall. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit, not sick, just I talk too much on my normal day. I am a criminal defense attorney, and I'm an Equal Justice Works fellow focused on bail reform, and I work at the Legal Rights Center, which is in Minneapolis. And I just want to tell you a little bit about the Legal Rights Center because I think it really grounds my response to this question. The Legal Rights Center was founded in 1970, and it was founded by Black activists and Native American activists in Minneapolis. And it was founded because the community realized that they didn't have attorneys, a law firm that would really fight for them and fight for their rights. This was before a statewide public defender system, and so the Legal Rights Center came about as a law firm of the people and for the people, and that really guides all of our work still. Everything that we do in the community, every choice we make in an advocacy position, every program that we start at Legal Rights Center comes from what the community is asking for. So we do a couple of things. We do criminal defense, and I'm on that team. We do that for adults and we do it for juveniles. So we are interested in diverting juveniles from the criminal legal system as much as possible. And some of the other work we do with juveniles is restorative services. So team members at Legal Rights Center go into schools and work with students who are facing truancy issues, who are facing disciplinary issues, work in circles with family members, with students, and with the schools to try to come up with a solution that doesn't involve pushing students out of schools, that doesn't involve pushing students into the criminal legal system. And then we have a community strategy arm, which does work around, it's kind of our policy and advocacy space, and it does work to build relationships with community members, with other leaders, with other organizations in Minneapolis and broader Minnesota. And all of our programming ultimately is oriented toward diverting resources from the criminal legal system, diverting people from the criminal legal system, and putting those resources and people in the community or keeping them in the community. And so when we talk about, what is the community's reaction to our work, what we would say is the community drives our work. The community dictates our work. Everything we do, every choice we make is based on what we hear from the community. And I think that that's a really important piece, and it's something that I've heard echoed through as, all of our panelists, because when we talk about community, we can talk about it kind of broadly, Minnesota, everyone. We can talk about specific communities within Minnesota, within the Twin Cities. We are all members of our community. We are all members of the communities that in the broad sense. But there are certain communities that Legal Rights Center focuses on, and those are the Black, Native American, and Latino communities in Hennepin County specifically. And we do that because, as has been mentioned, those are the most criminalized communities in the Twin Cities. We've talked about stats, but we haven't given numbers here today yet. But in 2017, Black people were incarcerated at 9 times the rate of white people in Minnesota. Native American people were incarcerated at 14 times the rate of white people in Minnesota. And that was 4 years ago, 5 years ago now, I guess. And that's troubling. And that's why the Legal Rights Center ultimately is grounded in those communities, because those people need to be the ones who are dictating how we move forward as a state. So while I can't tell you what individual members of our community feel about Legal Rights Center's work, I will say that we don't do anything without the say-so of members of our constituent community.
Thank you. Based on your organization's research, what would you say is evidence for or against the use of community police practices, and what are some of the most important community engagement conversations and programs that your organization focuses on?
I'll respond to that, Justice, and it'll build on everything that we just heard. And I love the community explanation and definition that we are all part of the same community. And so in my experience in working with law enforcement, and it's the captain, I would imagine, would appreciate this. It's kind of built on what the profession refers to as the Pelian principles, right? And that policing is best done when it's something that is not necessarily done to the community, or even as noble as it sounds, for the community, but with the community, right? That's when we get the best results, because we are all part of the community. The police are the community is the police, because we all want the same thing. And going back to understanding why, okay, when we look at these statistics and the data points of how our criminal justice system is highly populated with people of color, right? And that people of color are being convicted at higher rates, right? And so I think what comes into play is understanding why are those things happening, right? I love the question of understanding the purpose behind this, because it's if we lose sight of why we're doing what we're doing, then it's easy to become transactional and start to look at people as just data and numbers, and not understanding the importance of engaging people on a human level. And so the people that are on the receiving end of any form of marginalization or oppression or crisis are the ones best positioned to identify what the solutions need to be. That's why it needs to be a collaborative and co-creation of solutions on how we resolve these issues. And a lot of times, at least in my experience, and I was not always where I am today. When I started my relationship with law enforcement, it was somewhat contentious. Like, I walked through the doors of the police department because I felt as though I was being treated unfairly and unjustly. And the people that looked like me in my community were being treated unfairly and unjustly. And it started a conversation. And I'm so grateful and so thankful that that police chief received me with empathy. And that led to a relationship, led to a conversation. And so now, as I look at all of the things we throw at the feet of, and I know we're talking about criminal justice system with an emphasis on law enforcement, but I think part of the challenge is that's the lens as society that we often view things through, is that the solution needs to be there. And I don't think the profession is equipped. There's to resolve all the issues that we're throwing at their feet. They're not equipped. That's not the purpose of the profession. There are so many other social determinants to crime that happens. There is a collision course happening right now of some young black male, some young male in a community somewhere, young black male, that is on a collision course with an officer right now. And it's because of the things that have happened throughout the course of their lives, right? And if we expel, like, African-American males are being suspended and expelled from schools at a rate 4.1 times greater than their counterparts. We know that if you are not in school, it increases the likelihood of you ending up in the criminal justice system, of you ending up not getting a good job, of you ending up with all of these other social determinants of poverty and homelessness and health concerns and issues where all the inequities exist. And so unless we can come together and understand how what we are doing in all of our respective disciplines and industries are contributing to this crisis that we're talking about now, this is an all of us issue. Everyone that's on the screen here, that's logged in on Zoom, everyone that's in this audience, each and every one of us sitting up here, we all have a role and responsibility to hold each other accountable for doing our part, so that that collision course with that young man and that officer never even happens. And I think that's one of the things that we're not holding ourselves accountable for. It's easy for me to sit back and say, oh man, there needs to be education reform, and then just sit back and wait for those in the institution of education to do it. Or there needs to be police reform, and just sit back and wait for criminal justice reform, and not doing my part to help contribute to that. And I can't do it all, but whatever my gifts are, whatever my passions are, that is where I've been called to serve, to come alongside whatever that institution is, to do my part to make sure we're holding them accountable to deliver on the purpose, going back to why they exist, for what they have said that they've committed to contribute to the greater good of our society.
Thank you. It was very powerful. And going off that, what would you say would you say meaningful criminal justice reform is possible in the current climate of our country?
First off, anything is possible, but everybody has to play a part, and everybody has to play a part from a reality standpoint. See, I think that when we start having these conversations, I kind of feel like we start to turn away from how we even got to where we are today in the first place. I work for a government agency, and so when you have those measurable components, it causes you to pause and really look at specifically the organization or the company that has been that has been created, right? When I worked for a government agency, it was measured because it was a government agency. Let's be clear. So on this level, you had 78% minorities. Now we're starting to move up the ladder to management, upper management, and executives. So it went from 78%. Now we get managers. We dropped from 78% to 23%. Then it went to upper management. It dropped from 23% to 4%. And then when it got to executive management, it dropped to 0.1%. Like, that's a conversation that needs to be had. Where are we dropping the ball at in these different levels of this government agency, right? And it was talked about. It was continuously talked about. It was, as you say, putting things in, said things was being put in place, but nothing changed in 8 years that I was there, literally, right? So when we having these conversations, again, I think that those conversations has to be had from a reality standpoint. It was a form of a question as it pertains to community policing. First and foremost, we push for peace, stand firmly with law enforcement. And my objective within the communities in which I work in is to continue to bridge that gap. We have to bridge that gap because we're not going to be able to move forward without it. One of the things the captains alluded to was being more involved with community activities and community events and things to that magnitude, but that's also where we suffer the most because a lot of law enforcement, police officers, et cetera, that's not what's occurring in the city of Minneapolis. It's not what's occurring. Yeah, it's easy to be honest. Let's be clear. Hopkins, Edina, yeah, those things happen in those areas, but in the city of Minneapolis, in which we see it is right now today, that's not happening. That's not. I have a brother that's been a Chicago police officer for 23 years. 23 years. And he has not one time pulled his weapon. He has not one time shot his weapon. And when he's called to the community in which he grew up in for a 14-year-old, say, broke a car window, that relationship that you're referring to, my brother's able to identify with this young man. He's able, because he already has a relationship with him, right? And now that changed the deterrence of how that kid went into the criminal justice system, which is also another problem. We don't have that. So essentially, okay, I got a relationship with you guys, so I'm gonna talk to the prosecutor for you. But I don't have relationships with you, so I don't have anything to say on your behalf. And that's where the divide is happening at. And that's why you see the insurmountable numbers as it comes to the different nationalities and the different cultures and the different religions. That's what's happening, right? Again, my objective is to deal with point A. Point A is the neighborhoods in which we are trying to create different platforms for. And I say neighborhoods. Oftentimes you hear people say communities. Well, we've lost a sense of community a long time ago. Like a long time ago. Half the time, you don't even know who you're living next door to. See, back when we was growing up, along our lines, yeah, we knew Miss Thomas and Miss Franklin and Mr. Jones, and you got in trouble. Your parents knew before you even made it home. That was a sense of community. That was a sense of that village raising that child, not just one individual or one mother and father. That individual had a lot of mothers and fathers. Now we live in neighborhoods, which is a piece of we push for pieces. We trying to strengthen them neighborhoods to become communities again, because if you stand together, strength is in numbers. And we don't have those in these neighborhoods, which is why these crimes is happening in these neighborhoods. Whereas if that neighborhood was an actual community, anything that happened in that community is because they allowed it to happen, not because of what's happening now.
Thank you.
Does this work?
I
can't hear it.
Oh. maybe swap mics if you can.
Thanks. My name is Booker Hodges. I'm the Assistant Commissioner for the Minnesota Department of Public Safety. What does that mean? I oversee the Minnesota State Patrol, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and Alcohol and Gambling Enforcement. The Minnesota Department of Public Safety, we have about 2,900 employees. I'm responsible for about 1,500 of them. So you asked this question of how is criminal justice reform possible? The short answer in this current environment is no. I'm just going to be honest. We are very divided right now, both in our legislature and in our politics. But as we have these conversations, we've always, and me personally, have always taken the perspective of really engaging the community and actually listening to what people say they need, as opposed to coming in with some self-prescribed community criminal justice reform. So I'm just going to give you a couple of statistics. Between 2015 and 2020, in Minnesota, there were 369 African Americans killed in homicides. During that same time period, there was 280 white Americans killed in homicides. During that same time period, between 2015 and 2020, 12 African Americans were involved in deadly force encounters with law enforcement in Minnesota. During that same time period, 42 white or Caucasians were involved in deadly force encounters with law enforcement. I was born and raised in North Minneapolis. So when you look at these numbers and you look at where kind of the focus of the criminal justice reform goes, I just hope that we really start to engage the communities and figure out what they want, because the victim piece of this, and having been shot at 5 times, and none of them been when I was a police officer. One of my nephews got shot and left in the street to die. Fortunately, he lived last year. My other nephew was working on a campaign and a guy shot his best friend in front of him in the face. So at 15 years old, this is what you get to see. So when we have these discussions about criminal justice reform and what can it look like, I would just like us to take the approach that we take in emergency management, right? So like, say like there's a flood, right? You have the response, right? Then you have the recovery, then you have the restoration. So what does that mean, right? So the flood happens, you get all the emergency services out there to respond to try to stem the flood and try to, recover and save people. Then after that, we start to recover, right? That's when we start taking inventory and start demolishing stuff that needs to be demolished and rebuilt. And then the restoration piece is when we start rebuilding. And the piece that's missing in the criminal justice system is the restoration piece. We lock people up, but there's no restoration for them. And we for sure don't restore them, right? But we have to understand that we can't just stop locking people up, because 369 victims, and I think over 400 of the suspects in those same cases were African Americans. We cannot have people keep dying, getting killed, getting victimized, right? But when we have this discussion about the criminal justice piece, we really need to start focusing on the restoration and the recovery piece. And that's just a part that's always been missing when we have these discussions, is we don't talk about restoration and recovery of people. We just talk about the response, and then we edit our response techniques, and it's a hamster wheel, and I'm gonna be quiet. Typically what happens is this: some racially charged incident happens. This is our history in this country. Racially charged incident happens, riot happens, people start to take approaches in criminal justice that don't focus on victims. Then what happens? Then crime goes up, right? And then what do? We come back in with hard criminal penalties, right? So you go back to 1993 Crime Act, right? So then that circles, and then racially charged incident happens again, and now we keep doing this hamster wheel. At some point, we got to get off this hamster wheel and start to have that restoration and recovery piece.
I know we're coming up probably on the end here, but I would be remiss if I didn't jump in on this political question. And I just want to say I'm so glad your nephew is okay. But respectfully, I think I disagree on the political piece. I think that for those of us who are interested in a more equitable criminal legal system in Minnesota, we can't afford to wait for the opportune political moment. I won't pretend to speak for what I think Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would say, but I do think that he was willing to work in circumstances that were not at all favorable to what he was trying to do, and he did that for a very long time. I think for those of us who want to shape the narrative differently, we have to be willing to engage now with people across the political spectrum, because I think, as you see up here, there's a lot of energy in Minnesota for this work. There's a lot of energy for change. There's a lot of energy for making our state as equitable as we like to believe that it is, but we're not at that ideal yet. So, you know, when we're talking about criminal justice reform, that can come in a million different forms. One place that I personally see as a way, like something that we could do soon across the political spectrum, is reforming our cash bail system. You know, there's a lot of folks who are in jail right now because they can't afford to pay to leave jail. They've not been convicted of a crime, they've been charged with a crime, and they're sitting there because they can't afford to pay to leave. So we have a system in Minnesota that criminalizes being poor. And when you're locked up before your trial because you can't pay to get out, your case, you're gonna have worse outcomes. Studies show that you get convicted more when you can't work with your public defender or your defense attorney when you're outside of the jail. Studies show that people plead more often because they can't afford to sit in jail longer. And this is a liberty issue. You know, this is not a question of what do we do with the person who has been tried and convicted by a jury of their peers. This is a person who just was arrested on probable cause and, you know, can legally be held in our state right now. And there are folks all across the political system, I think, who have a problem with the idea of keeping someone locked up who is only in there because they can't afford to pay bail. And if they were wealthier, they wouldn't be in jail. They wouldn't be in jail waiting to get out. And so that's just an example, but that's one area that I think we have the opportunity to make change in this state. We have the opportunity to do it soon. And I think that as people who are interested in this, and I'm, you know, grateful to the folks on Zoom and grateful to the folks in this gorgeous sanctuary, that brings me a lot of hope. It's colorful, it's beautiful, and I really am grateful to be in this space. I think we need people like us to be willing to say, yes, change can happen, it can happen now. Because if we don't believe it can happen, it simply won't.
If I could add one thing, I loved everything you just said. It was really great. My name's Jazz Hampton. I had a flat tire this morning, so I was late. I apologize. I'm the co-founder of Turn Signal, which is an app. When you're pulled over or in a car accident, you press one button and it instantly starts recording the interaction and gives you an attorney on a video conference in that moment, 24/7, 365. A good example is someone was pulled over at 1:37 in the morning here in the state of Minnesota, and the attorney was on the line with that driver before the police officer was at their window. We always call ourselves an app to bridge the gap. I say that because before we launch, or as we were launching, I met with over 20 police officers, myself and my two other co-founders, to learn more about their perspective and how we can bridge that gap. And I think, you know, to this question of, is there a way we can, you know, bridge this divide and change the system as it's set? And we see ourselves as kind of that emergency services right now. I'm a lawyer. I practiced law for 5 years before I started doing this work. My brother graduated from Alexandria Tech's law enforcement program, right? So I live in a world where I really have conversations with a lot of these folks that are on both sides of this conversation. And one of the things I say about what the work we're doing is, we have to do something now, because I can't wait for legislative change that might take too long. I want to be there to de-escalate that interaction today. And I think social justice and what we're trying to do and what this panel is talking about is so often viewed in monolith type conversations where, are you kind of a Martin Luther King kind of activist, or are you a Rosa Parks, or are you a Malcolm X? And I think it's an ecosystem where there's a lot of different styles of approaching how to resolve these issues. And there's a place for all of those people and styles within that ecosystem. And the same is true with changes. Some have to be immediate and in the moment. What we do now, how do we make those interactions safer when folks are driving? Others have to be legislative. Others have to reform cash bail. Others have to talk about recidivism and all of the like. So I think there absolutely is a way but it takes so many people doing so much work. And that's also why I'm really thankful for the people that are on this panel, because you can see that it's being done from so many different places.
Thank you.
Thank you for all of that perspective. And I'd like to add, I mentioned the idea of that silo that we can all end up in before. We talked about how Hopkins, Edina, Minnetonka are definitely different than the city of Minneapolis. I can say for the first time in my 23-year career, it's within the last 2 years that the city of Minneapolis actually reached out to us suburban agencies and said, can you help us? And I think that's because they were in a silo for many, many years. And I like the point, we need change. I think, across this entire panel, we've talked about people that are very enthusiastic for change, people that may not think change is as readily available. But I do believe that we all have optimism that it will occur. I hope that we never have to have another tragedy within our communities, within our neighborhoods, to drive that change. I think that's a key point. I refer to it as we all lose track of history. Nobody pays attention to history, and what do? We repeat ourselves. How can we stop doing that? How can we get off that wheel? And I think that comes back to being humble. We all need humility. Everybody within the community needs to come forward and accept that myself as an individual person, I don't have all the answers. I can ask you what you think is a good idea. I can ask you what you think is the best movement forward, but we need to be accepting, all of us, of our different roles. I may understand certain things about police work. I can only train our police officers so much. We were the first agency in the state of Minnesota to get all of our officers trained in procedural justice. That's a great statistic. It looks great in our annual report, but what does that really mean? That means that we're at least trying to make an effort for what we don't inherently live every day. We can try to train ourselves on. We can try to meet with members of the community, and we can try to understand where they're coming from. But it doesn't change that we still need to get into those neighborhoods. We talked a little bit about that accountability aspect early on here. And it does come down to that. At some point, we all have to be accountable for the actions that we have, whether we're talking about criminal justice reform, or we're talking about just being good stewards in our communities. It all comes down to that personal responsibility aspect. And so, back to the community policing question. Is it possible? Is it a good thing? I think it is, but it's not government driven. It's not how can somebody put on a piece of paper what you should do. There's all sorts of models within law enforcement of the SARA model response to community policing and identifying a problem and going out and researching it and implementing a response. Sure, in certain settings that may work. You can formalize it that way. What really matters is do I know who the night clerk is at the Holiday gas station or at the Walgreens, so that when I walk in there, I can call them by name and I can find out what's going on. And aside from that, do I know who is the manager of the apartment building, so that I can approach them and find out, hey, what's going on in this building? What's happening here? Because I don't live there. And we can't look at it and go, okay, well, all law enforcement officers should live in their communities. That's a great idea, but we live in a metropolitan area where certain areas of Hopkins, I cannot afford to live in. And so how do we bring that idea forward? And what it is we as law enforcement officers, we need to be out there. I like to share a little story, and I'm probably outing myself a little bit, but part of it is I really enjoy motorcycling. It's one of my summer-long passions. Pastor Scott teases me all the time about my knee, which was destroyed in a motorcycle crash several years ago. We should talk about those yellow flashing arrows. They're dangerous. So, but part of it is that I have a friend that works here in Hopkins. It's been a bouncer at a bar, going back, knowing who lives in your community. He was a bouncer in Hopkins. He's a bartender in Hopkins. He's also a motorcyclist, and we have common ground. He doesn't look like me. He's a lot taller, a lot darker skinned, and he also lives in North Minneapolis. We share our cell phones with each other, and he's also a member of a motorcycle club, if you will. And I can guarantee you, I'm the only police officer that was ever been to their clubhouse party in North Minneapolis, at their clubhouse. Now, he didn't out me as a police officer. I didn't out myself as a police officer, but I went and I hung out with people in that community. And the point to all of that is we have to open ourselves up to be in environments that may not be comfortable, but learn. And going back to all this, that is community policing. It's understanding who does it affect? Who lives in that neighborhood? How do you want to be treated? Golden age rule. Treat others as you want to be treated and get to know them. So, thank you.
Thank
So
you.
what can this work? I think this works, right? Yeah, you can hear me on it. I think you're right. We all have to go into areas where we're uncomfortable. If you take a look at this panel, that certainly is the case. And I don't pretend to know everyone. Some people I just met today. But that's very true. So when we talk about reform, I really think reform has to do with the individual. What you decide to do with your time, your money, your goodwill. I was an immigrant refugee from Vietnam when I came here at the age of 9. Didn't speak any English, had a single mom with 2 older brothers, and growing up in St. Cloud, I was an Asian male. I had a big chip on my shoulder. Every fight that came to me, I took it. And I was like a 105-pound soaking wet towel. And I lost many fights. But I took every one of them, right? Because I was mad. I was mad because I got here and it was supposed to be great and it wasn't. I got here because I was on food stamps and I didn't have a dad. I got here because everyone spoke English and I was still learning how to spell the word dog, right? I got here because once I learned how to spell dog and cat and rain, they said it's raining cats and dogs, and I went outside and cats and dogs were not falling from the sky, right? That's an idiom, right? So things are difficult to figure out when you're younger and a refugee and an immigrant. And I thought, okay, I just want to get a job that I don't have to talk about race all the time. I just want to get a job where people will respect me and where I can just help them. And in Stearns County, St. Cloud, I thought maybe I'll just become a cop. Because, you know, when you call 911, you just need help. And if I can just be that person that gets that privilege, I think of jumping into the chaos of someone's life and able to at least help for that very small moment, very small moment in time, then maybe at their dinner table they can say, you know, I met an Asian guy and they're not that bad. That guy actually helped me today, right? And that's literally it. I didn't want to do a million panels. I didn't want to do ethics classes. I didn't want to sit and talk about you know, pho and fried rice and tell people to eat my mom's egg rolls and how we were great. I hated all that. I hated it with a passion because it gets tiring, because I don't think you can kill racism and animosity with a potluck. You just can't do it. You can enjoy each other's food, but then you go home and then you can just say your own thing. That's what Minnesota's really good at, and that's what we do again and again. So I just thought maybe I'll become a cop. And I'll tell you, being a cop is so hard. It's such a hard job. I went through the Explorer program when I was 14, and I did all that, which is shadowing cops for years, and then you finally get to become a police officer, and you work your way up. And my very first call, after you know you kick the trainers out of your squad car, and you can finally be your own police officer. My very first call, assault in progress. I get there, I'm bright, I'm shiny. I got my squad car, I got my badge, I got my gun. I'm 19 years old. I'm full of you know, whatever and vinegar, right? And I'm running up. And this guy, white guy, is literally getting his butt kicked. Like, he's on the ground, his hand is like this, he's bleeding from the face. Another guy who's beating him up is another white dude. And I can see the assault in progress. And this is like, you know, hero stuff, Die Hard. I'm running to the scene, I'm able to help. And when I get there, both individuals, victim and assailant, defendant, look at me, and we all three have a moment where I think to myself, am I wearing a space alien costume? Am I wearing a clown costume? Do I look like Ronald McDonald right now? What? They looked at me so strangely that the three of us just stopped. And the guy who was bleeding from his face, and I'll never ever forget it, looks up at me and he says, "I want an American cop." That's what he says at that moment in time. I want an American cop. You people hear how I sound, right? Like on a drive-through, McDonald's drive-through, I sound like a white person, right? I've sounded this way for a very long time. My mom says, "What's wrong with you, Hao? You're the only Vietnamese person I hear speak Vietnamese with an American accent." And I said, "Ma, I don't know. This is how it is." So that person who was getting his butt kicked said, "I want an American cop." I could have been born in Cold Spring, Minnesota, for all he knew. I could have been a very American cop. In fact, I was just a cop. But that showed me that that person, okay, here's the deal. Survival, fight or flight, right? Bare bones. That instinct is so ingrained in us, we become animals, right? We're either gonna fight our way out or we're gonna survive and run. That guy's fight or flight animal instinct of survival was like his racism was outweighed by that. I mean, outweighed by that. And that taught me something. That taught me that a uniform, a job, a position does not necessarily solve all those ingrained issues of racism, discrimination, and all of that. It takes more. It takes coming back. It takes staying at the call. It takes doing your job. It takes showing up on a Sunday after you try to make pancakes for your kids and rush out while your wife's already kind of stressed out to go talk to a church full of people. It takes that. I think you need to do that. I think it takes sitting next to a police officer who, right now, prosecutors and police officers, we don't all get along that well because we have different ideas about what we should be doing. But I think the issue is that we have the same aims, which is just trying to keep people safe and trying to make sure that people have what they need so our system isn't robust. We do not need a bigger criminal justice system. When new lawyers start, when I was a brand new prosecutor in 2010, I had 170 caseload. Every single day, people were just showing up. And we didn't try 170 cases a day. The system would grind to a halt. So we have this plea bargain system. You plead guilty, you pay this fine, I don't charge you higher, or I give you a lesser charge, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I will stop very quickly because I know I've been talking a long time. Lawyers do that. But the highest standard we have in our land is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's like the highest legal standard, right? And so when you're charged with a crime, the prosecutor has to meet that standard in front of a jury. So we have to take that evidence, all those facts that we have, and we have to throw it against the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And if that can't, and if it doesn't suffice, or if it doesn't, permeate and get past proof beyond a reasonable doubt, then it's a not guilty and people get to go home. That's the highest standard. We're not even, civil standards are different for loads and loads of billions of dollars. That's even a lesser standard. But when we're talking about your freedom, when we're talking about people's freedom, proof beyond a reasonable doubt is the highest standard, and our founders understood that. Oh, but in the 1920s or 30s, we became this thing called the plea bargain system. Those radiators that are on the ground, the water radiators, right? The metal ones that heat your homes or the old homes and things like that. Once those things, when they first started building those things, they blew up because they got so hot, they just blow up and those pipes would burst. So what did they do? They added those little steam valves because once it got too hot, all the steam would spray out and then the thing wouldn't blow up and then it would keep working. The criminal justice system, when it first started, didn't have a steam valve. It just was working and working. Then we got so efficient at charging people, we got so efficient at incarcerating people, that we needed a steam valve. And that steam valve was called the plea bargain system. And so in the plea bargain system is, I don't have to take that evidence and throw it against proof beyond a reasonable doubt in front of a jury of your peers, quote unquote. And then I never have to meet that burden, so that you plead guilty, I get the conviction, which is not all that important sometimes, and then I can move on. And we can deal with the next case, and the next case, and the next case, and the next case. If you ask most young prosecutors who start, they have no idea that the plea bargain system was a shame back in the day, that there were legal scholars arguing, why are we eroding the Constitution? How come we have to have this thing? It's not letting our proof beyond a reasonable doubt, our highest standard, our citizens deserve that. We don't even understand that that thing isn't supposed to be there. We've gotten so good at it. So when we talk about reform, I think we need to really take a look at the systems that are in place and why they're there and what we're doing with those things. I need to not plea out a case just because I have 500 other cases behind me. I need to stop the train. And I know that's really hard because you have judges who are like, hey, get in here, Mr. Wen, get in here, get in here. We have another case. I know we have defense attorneys, public defenders who are all overworked, etc. I know we have jails and correctional facilities that are completely full, but we need to stop and ask, what are we doing to this defendant, to this individual, and why are we doing it and how are we helping? And I think we need to talk about what the commissioner was saying. How are we going to actually help on the back end? What are we going to do? What resources are we going to provide? So we showed up, so we stopped the fire hydrant, so we put the Band-Aid on. What does that mean? How do we actually stop it? So when I talk about reform, I'm really talking about, okay, for you people at home, for you wonderful citizens and part of this congregation, thank you so much for having us. But what does it mean for you? If you don't live in Minneapolis, if you don't live in what other communities that are like, on fire and you see it on the news and everyone's like, well, that's them, that's what's going on with them. What does that mean for you? I think that I would ask it to mean this. I would ask it if somewhere, some way, if something bad happens to you, someone does something wrong to you, that your first reaction isn't, incarceration, punishment, let's do something to that individual. It's always easy to have these conversations until the bad thing happens to you. And then you say, oh yeah, but let's take care of that. For a minute, it's a knee-jerk reaction to say let's punish. But let's think about the other thing. Why did it happen? Does it have to happen? And is sending them to jail or prison going to make me feel better? And why? And if that answer is no, then talk to your law enforcement officer. Talk to your prosecutor. Because I gotta tell you, it is so much easier for me to do something more equitable, more I think long-lasting, if a victim actually starts to think that on their own, and we can have those discussions right then and there. So I think it really starts with all of us, putting ourselves in places that are uncomfortable. And sometimes uncomfortable things will just happen to you, but it's how you react to that. So that's what I would ask.
Well, thank you. That was very powerful and meaningful. And Pastor Scott, I believe you have some closing remarks, but thank you, panelists, for your time. We're really grateful for that, especially on a Sunday. Thank you.
Just only to say thank you to our panelists. Folks online, you can go ahead and unmute and offer a round of applause and thanks. And I'm sorry for being the disembodied voice up in the balcony, but thank you so much for spending your Sunday morning with us, especially if you had a flat tire. So those in the room, give them a round of applause, and those online as well. And to everybody online and those in the room, go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God. Thank you for being here this morning.